Welcome to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Focused solely on workplace issues, it is our job to help employers develop proactive strategies, strong policies, and business-oriented solutions to cultivate an engaged, stable, and inclusive workforce. Our podcast identifies issues that influence and impact the workplace and its continuing evolution, and helps answer the question on every employer's mind: how will my business be impacted? Restaurant operators and employers may likely face significant challenges in hiring and retaining their workforces under the new administration. On this episode of We Get Work, we discuss increased I-9 enforcement and inspections, along with practical steps restaurant employers can take to prepare for potential audits, investigations, and worksite enforcement actions by proactively ensuring their workforce eligibility status complies with federal regulations. Our hosts today are Felice Eckelman, co-leader of the Restaurant Group, and Amy Peck, co-leader of the Immigration Group, and principals, respectively, in Jackson Lewis's New York City and Omaha offices. Felice and Amy, the question on everyone's mind today is, as President Trump embarks on his second term, how can restaurant employers best prepare to comply with changing immigration regulations, and how does that impact my business?
Thank you, Alicia. I asked Amy to join me today because, Amy, so many of our restaurant clients are asking what they can be doing now in anticipation of changes that the new administration may bring with regard to compliance with our immigration laws. And first and foremost, restaurant clients in particular are asking about I-9s. They are asking whether they should conduct an audit, whether they should consider the E-Verify program. And I was hoping you could help unravel some of these issues for employers in this industry. And so those are my first questions, Amy.
All right, Felice, let's get started. So the I-9 is foundational to any compliance program. And yes, restaurants should be looking at their I-9s. An internal I-9 audit is essential, particularly in the next few years. Now, when I say internal I-9 audit, what I'm talking about is not self-surgery in the sense that you look at your own I-9s and determine whether they're compliant. It is something that you want outside help on because you don't want to perform surgery on yourself. It's always a bad idea. It's a good idea to have an independent judgment on those forms I-9. It can be such a big liability if you are audited, up to $2,800 per I-9 for fines if you make mistakes.
Hold on. Let me make sure I heard you, Amy. $2,700 or $2,800 per I-9.
That's right.
That is the financial liability for mistakes.
That's right, Felice. It can be devastating for a business. And if you're using paper I-9s, it would not be unusual to see a 50% error rate. So, those fines really rack up. So, yes, step one in a compliance program would be have a professional I-9 audit done on your I-9s. If you're thinking, well, I don't have the budget for my entire organization, a spot audit can always be done. And, kind of a how are we doing spot audit. So that's something that I think it should be done immediately.
And if an employer sees with this spot audit, with help, outside help, that there are errors or omissions, is it possible to make corrections and improve compliance?
It is. And that's the wonderful thing. Remediation of an I-9 often will fix the errors. And it'll fix the error, but it will also reduce the liability. There are some types of errors like timeliness violations where maybe you're late on that I-9, that has a statute of limitations that might be associated with it. But everything else, as soon as you fix it, they can no longer fine on it. So it's a good idea to do that. The other thing, this is the other reason to do a professional I-9 audit, is remediation is done on the form itself. Therefore, if it's done incorrectly, you can invalidate the form. So remediation rules, like how to fix the I-9, there's over 600 variables. So it's important to do it right the first time so that form isn't invalidated or you make it worse.
So I'm understanding that the first step might be to just make sure you have I-9s. The second step would be have someone take a look at them, at least a spot check. And then the third step would be come up with a remediation program, a fix-it program, if there are errors and omissions. Do I have that right?
Yes, you do.
Great.
And let's layer E-Verify on top of that, because you did ask about that.
Now, can you explain for our audience what the E-Verify program is? Because I want to make sure that everyone who's listening has an understanding that's accurate.
You bet. E-Verify is a government system that is used to verify information that is on Form I-9. And in some instances, it's used to verify the photograph on certain documentation that's presented, like a U.S. passport. And it can be an addition to and an enhancement of your compliance program, as long as you're doing E-Verify well. It can also be a deterrent to ID fraud, although it is not in any way perfect, because E-Verify system, the E-Verify validations can be they can be beaten through ID theft or ID borrowing or something like that. But it can be an enhancement. It's not always a good idea for every client to use E-Verify, however, because it takes additional resources. It takes training. If there's high turnover in your HR roles, it might not be a good idea for you, although it is mandatory in certain states. So that's something you'd want to look at.
Okay. So is there a cost to enrolling in the E-Verify program?
There's no external cost.
Okay. So the cost is making sure that folks within your organization are trained to use the program accurately, as I understand it.
That's correct, Felice. And if you are doing E-Verify incorrectly, it can cause that the data is being collected by the government. And if there are certain aberrations in your data, the E-Verify system will alert and sometimes notify other government agencies, and it can actually cause an audit. So, or an investigation. So that's why if you do choose to do E-Verify, or if you're required to do it, you must do it well.
And is it a possibility that employers can try E-Verify on a pilot basis or for just a portion of their workforce? Or is the program all or nothing, so to speak?
There's no pilot per se, but you can pick and choose the states or even the locations within a state that you want to do E-Verify. So for example, if you say, well, we're in Florida, so it's mandatory there, we're going to do it there, but we're also in Nebraska. It's not mandatory in Nebraska, so we're not going to do it there. That is perfectly acceptable.
Thanks for that. And you mentioned audits and investigations. So are these two different approaches that the government can take? I assume this is the federal government that we're talking about.
That's right. There are state audits of I-9 documentation or E-Verify, the state cannot audit I-9s unless it's a criminal investigation and the I-9 gets pulled into an investigation. But the federal government has a couple different tools in its toolbox. The most common tool is the government notice of inspection, which is an I-9 audit. And those really are driven in terms of numbers by the administration. The Biden administration didn't do very many. Trump first administration did a whole bunch. We expect that government I-9 audits will be on the increase here in the next 4 years. And we also understand that they're looking at staffing up for that. So that's why certain industries and certain businesses and certain geographic areas, you really need to be ready for an I-9 audit to come in your door.
And how will an employer know that they are being targeted with an I-9 audit? I assume they get a written letter from, is it ICE that would send it?
It's Immigration Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security Investigations, which is a division of Department of Homeland Security.
So this is something that shouldn't be ignored, I gather.
Yeah, that's correct. You should alert your folks to look for this. Now, if the government's following the rules, they will show up and personally deliver this. I've had some auditors try to mail them, but it should be personally delivered. And one of the tricks that the government does is they say, hey, this is a notice of inspection I-9 audit. Why don't you just give these I-9s to us right now? No.
You mean hand them over?
That's right. Now, you are required to hand over the original I-9s, but you have 3 business days to do that. That's not very much time, but you still, by law, have 3 days to turn them over. And it's rarely extended. So if one of the take homes for folks listening to this is ask yourself, am I ready to produce I-9s in 3 days? You should take every minute of that to make sure everything's ready. And don't take the government up on their generous and kind offer to hand them over right when they walk in the door. So that's
and so if I am listening to this and I'm hearing 3 days to turn over my I-9s, separate, there's no time for an audit at that point because 3 days is not going to be enough time. But what can I do? What would I do during those 3 days? Just gather the I-9s and hope for the best?
Yeah, you call your lawyer to help. Sometimes the notice of inspection is actually not correct. And so many times you can, call the auditor and say, you got to redo this. Here's all the things that are wrong, like the business name's wrong. It's not a legal entity. In the meantime, you're scrambling like mad to try to get the I-9s ready. If there is time, you can remediate those I-9s. Often there isn't, like you said, but you're making sure you have an I-9 for each employee. There is an administrative subpoena that's often served with the notice of inspection, and it will have a number of other documents that they're asking for. You have additional time to produce those documents like payroll records and things like that. But the 3 days is the I-9 and the list of acceptable documents, like whatever was copied in connection with that I-9. Those must be produced. E-Verify records as well. So that's something that you need to be ready for that.
And what you've just described is an audit, not a raid. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And are there raids? This is what people are talking about. So is this a real concern for employers?
Yeah, the word raid is actually not one that the government uses. They say worksite enforcement action. So to be technically correct, we would call it a worksite enforcement action, not a raid. But Raids are they're typically generated by what the government feels is criminal activity, in addition to having folks working at that work site who are not documented. But a raid involves a lot of planning. It involves subpoenas. There's a lot of personnel involved. Typically, the government tips off the media, and so the media is there with the cameras, and they come to a location, they surround the location, they come in and arrest the workers, sometimes the management, if there is, in certain cases, serve the subpoenas, grab computers and documents, and that is something that we do expect to happen in the next 4 years because they're splashy. The public is led to believe that the government is doing something about the so-called illegal immigration problem, even though in terms of long-term impact on any type of compliance or, solving the issue of undocumented workers, it's spitting in the wind. But it's splashy and popular with certain administrations.
Do you think we'll see any raids in the hospitality industry, or was that just be total conjecture?
Well, it is conjecture, but I think hospitality industry is at risk. Certain properties, maybe, there are targets with this administration. We know that. And I mean that not in the criminal sense that it's, they use that word, but like, I think they have specific people or companies they want to go after. And hospitality industry, it wouldn't shock me at all. Manufacturing and food production is more typical. Agriculture, there were some raids in the last administration at feedlots, and food production. But I think the gloves are coming off this time, and they're going to widen their lens.
Some clients have asked whether it's a good idea to avoid this kind of situation with I-9 compliance audits and possible worksite compliance actions by engaging third-party staffing agencies. Is that a quick fix to this problem?
It is not. And we could spend a whole hour on this issue. It is rumored that this administration is going to take a hard look at contractors and staffing agencies in the sense that there is a belief that some are not following the rules and that many undocumented workers are getting work through these agencies. Whether it's true or not, that is the belief. So to the extent you are using staffing companies or contractors, make sure that those contracts are shored up, that you have strenuous compliance provisions in those contracts that require those contractors to have vetted the employees. Maybe you add an E-Verify provision, and that you have trained your staff that to the extent they hear any rumors of contractors not being lawful, maybe being underage, that immediately that information has to come to management, and you cannot ignore that. So there's a lot of moving pieces to that, but you can't just blithely and blindly say, well, we'll just hire contractors. That is not a good idea.
Right. So you can't be sure you can hide behind a staffing agency or independent contractor situation.
Yeah, you absolutely.
That's good advice. And some of our clients have asked whether if they operate in cities that are designated as sanctuary cities, whether they can expect different outcomes from the federal government because of the designation as a sanctuary city. Can you help us with that?
There is a belief that sanctuary cities will be targeted. I think there was some rhetoric actually by the Trump administration folks saying that there would be a focus on sanctuary cities. I don't know. I think that's certainly a concern, but Trump won. Trump administration, the first one, uh, most of the worksite enforcement actions, aka raids, were in red states. So I don't think anyone is safe. I don't think you can sit back and say, well, I'm in a deeply red area or whatever, and we're going to be fine. It doesn't work that way. It didn't last time. I think if you are in an industry that has a high number of immigrant workers, or any number of factors, you could be the subject of one of these enforcement actions or I-9 audits. I think you just need to take care of your compliance, and then what happens, but you cannot sit back and say, well, it's not going to be me.
So at this point, I think all of our hospitality clients would be well served to assume that they could be subject to some kind of review by the federal government. So I guess we're back to what we started with, which is the I-9, making sure that competent staff are handling the I-9s, that they are being retained, right?
Right.
I think even terminated employees, I-9s, have to be retained for, am I right, Amy, 3 years post-termination?
It's 1 year or 3 years, depending on date of hire. So there's an algorithm there. But yes, they must be retained for a certain period of time after the termination.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, all active employees need I-9. So that's
all active employees need I-9. So it's never too late to do a self-audit.
That's right. And if there's missing I-9s, it's never too late to do a new one. In fact, you should. So you should make sure, and I think, Felice, you mentioned that at the beginning, make sure everyone has an I-9. That's like step one. Yep. You don't need a lawyer for that. Just get those I-9s executed for any employee that doesn't have one.
So any other words that you would offer to our industry clients with restaurants on this issue?
I think it's time, if you haven't been paying attention to compliance, that needs to move to the very top. And, the thing is about compliance, it kind of sits in the background in the corner. And it's something that, gets pushed aside because all these other things are going on, right? You're trying to find people to work. You're, doing 100 different things. And then compliance is there and it pounces. And when it does, it hurts really bad. So move it to the top, deal with it, make sure you've got your house in order. Then you can forget about it again for a while. If you do a spot audit and you find out your I-9s aren't very good, training needs to be moved to the top. I-9 training only takes about an hour or so, and it reaps huge benefits for you. But I would say just deal with it, and then you can go on to more important things. Even though this is really important, but you've got a
bigger
million
and better things.
A million, yeah, maybe better things.
Well, thank you, Amy. And Amy is one of the leaders of our immigration practice and compliance group. And you help clients in all industries all across the country. So thank you, Amy, for your expertise and wise words.
Thank you. Thanks, Felice.
Bye.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you for joining us on We Get Work. Please tune in to our next program where we will continue to tell you not only what's legal, but what is effective. We Get Work is available to stream and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Libsyn, SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. For more information on today's topic, our presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, visit jacksonlewis.com. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient.